Have you ever encountered a story so peculiar, so contradictory, and so intensely human that it refuses to be tidied up into a neat Hollywood narrative? Today, let's take a thoughtful walk through one of those stories. Imagine the ordinary moments of early youth, college classes, hanging out with friends, maybe daydreaming about the future, and then everything changes in one terrifying instant. That sudden rupture catapults a young woman from quiet anonymity into the center of a national spectacle. It's the kind of story that makes you wonder, how would any of us react under those conditions? Let's lean in a little closer to the life of Patricia Hearst, an heiress thrust by violence and fear onto a bizarre stage of radical politics, sensational media coverage, and a trial that captivated the world. The path that led Patricia Hearst into American folklore did not begin in a vacuum. When she was born on February 20th, 1954, the ripple of her family's last name alone already cast shadows and expectations. The Hearst dynasty was an icon of American media power, rooted in the legacy of William Randolph Hearst, whose newspapers shaped public opinion across the United States for decades. But let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. Before we can fully grasp the emotional hurricane that blew through Patricia's life, it helps to know a bit about the swirling winds of the era in which she was raised, an era marked by shifting social norms, rapid cultural change, and simmering political tension. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Hollywood was undergoing its own identity crisis. The old studio system had been crumbling for years, replaced by creative risk-taking and edgy content that challenged the more sanitized productions of the prior decades. Movies like Easy Rider paved the way for radical storytelling and uncensored dialogue, reflecting a broader social revolution. The old guard was being replaced by a new wave of directors and actors unafraid to question authority. On the streets, the aftershocks of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement heightened political engagement. Protests and radical groups became increasingly visible, and the nightly news delivered images of urban unrest right into people's living rooms. It was as though the entire country was holding its breath, uncertain whether all these raging tensions would lead to dramatic change or collective breakdown. Patricia Hearst found herself positioned at the crossroads of these cultural and political upheavals, though she never asked for that role. She was raised in a life of significant comfort, the third of 5 daughters in a family that carried the burden and privilege of a famous surname. By most accounts, her early life was more or less typical for someone of her elite social status. Photographs from the family album show an obedient-looking child with neatly combed hair, dresses free of wrinkles, playing with her sisters in well-kept backyards. People like to imagine an ultra-glamorous upbringing for the children of American dynasties, but in many ways, Patricia's daily routine would have looked familiar. School obligations, family gatherings, sleepovers with close friends. That's not to say she wasn't aware of the expectations swirling around her. There was an unmistakable sense that the Hearst name opened doors. For some in the family, it was an exhilarating invitation to be part of America's most powerful media empire. For others, Patricia included, it was more complicated. High society can be stifling, even isolating, and sometimes the idea of being a Hearst carried a weight all its own. Still, Patricia never publicly bristled at the family name. She wasn't particularly rebellious during her teenage years. She had enough comfort to insulate her from many of the everyday struggles her peers outside wealth might have experienced. Yet she was never groomed in the same intense way some other heirs or heiresses might be. The family somewhat expected her to keep a tidy public image, continue her education, and step carefully into whichever role came next. But fate had other ideas. In February 1974, Patricia was living in Berkeley, California, as a student at the University of California. At the time, Berkeley was a hotbed of political protests, and the city carried a long tradition of social activism. Yet Patricia wasn't heavily involved with any of it. She was building the kind of life any 19-year-old might piece together. She shared an apartment with her fiancé, Stephen Weed, and was juggling coursework, typical campus worries, and the excitement of planning her future. Then on the night of February 4th, 1974, everything changed. A small group of armed individuals stormed the apartment, smashing through doors, terrorizing her fiancé, and dragging Patricia out with them at gunpoint. The group was the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, an extremist organization that had emerged from the swirling tides of radical politics. At first, the public believed Patricia Hearst was simply a kidnapping victim. That was the natural assumption. She was an heiress to a powerful media fortune after all. Maybe this was all about ransom. But as days stretched into weeks, the SLA issued increasingly bizarre demands, insisting the Hearst family bankroll free food distributions for the poor in California. While Patricia's father arranged large-scale food giveaways in compliance with the group's demands, America watched with shock. This kind of extortion from a radical group was a far cry from the typical kidnapping scenario. The SLA's public messages were littered with strange references to revolutionary ideals, promising violent retribution against anyone in league with the capitalist machine. Even after the demanded food distribution took place, Patricia remained captive. And then the story took its first surreal turn. 2 months into her abduction, new audio tapes were released. Instead of hearing a desperate hostage pleading for release, the American public heard the voice of Patricia Hearst declaring she had joined the SLA of her own volition, reborn under a new name, Tanya. She sounded emboldened, scolding her family for not doing enough to help the poor and speaking with the bizarre rhetoric of SLA manifestos. People all over the nation were stunned, outraged, and confused. It was a media frenzy. How could an heiress from one of America's wealthiest families now declare allegiance to a fringe, radical group? Soon after that, security camera photos from a bank robbery in San Francisco started circulating, showing Patricia brandishing a weapon alongside SLA members. Headlines referred to her as a urban guerrilla. Talk show pundits debated whether she was coerced, brainwashed, or simply radicalized in captivity. Almost overnight, Patricia Hearst became a symbol of a generation's anxieties. But for those who actually knew her, and for Patricia herself, this was no simple tale of rebellious transformation. It was a nightmare. The confusion only grew when the FBI launched a nationwide manhunt. Patricia Hearst was no longer viewed as merely a victim, but as a criminal suspect. She and the SLA members were on the run, relocating from one safe house to another. There were dramatic shootouts, tense standoffs, and near misses that made the nightly news. In May 1974, 6 SLA members died in a fiery confrontation with police in Los Angeles. Patricia was not in that hideout, and she vanished again, slipping away with remaining members of the group. For months, sightings were reported in different parts of the country, from California to Pennsylvania. Some speculated she was an unwilling participant, held in a psychological cage of terror. Others insisted she had become a fully committed revolutionary. The media coverage was relentless, and her family's heartbreak was plastered on front pages. Eventually, on September 18, 1975, the FBI apprehended Patricia Hearst in a San Francisco apartment. According to one agent on the scene, she was discovered cowering in a closet, small, frightened, and holding on to the last shreds of whatever illusions she'd been fed. She was promptly arrested and taken into federal custody. Months passed, and the legal processes kicked into high gear. The sensational kidnapping victim would now stand trial for the crime she committed while seemingly under the SLA's influence. This was a storyline that even the most imaginative Hollywood screenwriters would hesitate to invent. But for Patricia, it was no fiction. The trial that ensued in 1976 was one of the most riveting and polarizing in modern American history. Cameras clamored for every photograph of the petite defendant. Reporters hungrily recounted the day's revelations, how Patricia was locked in a closet for weeks, subjected to threats of violence, possibly sexual assault, and unrelenting propaganda from SLA leaders. According to defense witnesses, she was told that her family hadn't really cared enough to fulfill every demand. That ongoing psychological torment, argued her attorneys, was the reason she had adopted the new persona of Tanya. She was experiencing a survival mechanism, the Stockholm Syndrome, a condition where hostages identify or bond with their captors. Meanwhile, the prosecution pointed to the bank robbery footage, the unambiguous images of her holding a gun, and earlier recordings of her denouncing her family's wealth. They insisted that Patricia's cooperation went far beyond mere coercion. They argued that even a traumatized hostage would have seized an opportunity to flee if one had presented itself. Could Patricia have escaped earlier but chose not to? Was she truly under their psychological spell, or had she discovered a dark sense of purpose in the SLA's revolutionary calls? This debate raged in courtrooms and living rooms across America. Judge Oliver Carter presided over a legal battle that set the stage for the crucial question of personal responsibility under extreme duress. In the end, despite Patricia's claims of brainwashing and forced participation, she was convicted of bank robbery and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Her supporters deemed the verdict an outrage, citing her months of captivity and the disturbing conditions of her so-called conversion. Critics maintained that the wealth and privilege of the Hearst family had, ironically, allowed Patricia to mount a more compelling defense than a poorer defendant might have managed in similar circumstances. After spending roughly 2 years in prison, President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence in 1979. She was freed from the physical confines of the penitentiary, but she couldn't walk away from the public's fascination so easily. A swirl of conflicting opinions followed her wherever she went. Some still labeled her a criminal. Others saw her as a victim of political fanaticism. Decades later, President Bill Clinton granted her a full pardon on his last day in office in 2001, a move that reignited debate about the extent of her culpability and the long-standing question, could she have done something different? For Patricia herself, the emotional toll was incalculable. She once gave an interview describing how each day in captivity felt like an eternity of dread, and that her Tanya persona was purely a survival tactic. In her memoir, she recalled the fear that if she did not follow orders to the letter, she would be killed, exactly as the SLA threatened. She recounted that the first time she was given a weapon and forced to pose for a propaganda photo, she felt an icy terror as she wondered whether each snapshot might be her last living moment. And yet, rarely discussed in public discourse, is a short, handwritten note Patricia purportedly wrote in the immediate weeks after her kidnapping, discovered years later in an SLA safe house, raided by authorities. The note was addressed to her sisters, though it was never delivered. The content was heartbreakingly simple. If I'm not the same when you see me, remember who I was. I'll come back if I can. The authenticity of the note remains debated by scholars, but it offers a harrowing peek into a mind grappling with survival. It suggests that Patricia felt herself slipping away under the SLA's psychological grip. Whether she could have fought harder or done more to break free is a question only she can truly answer. Another lesser-known anecdote speaks to the complexity of the emotional turmoil she endured. An old friend from her high school years, who requested anonymity in a vintage interview from the late 1980s, recounted how Patricia sent a discreet message during her time on the run with the SLA. This friend claimed that Patricia reached out in a phone call, speaking in hushed, trembling tones. According to the friend, Patricia didn't ask for help. She just asked that her friend pray for her and told her, "I'm afraid all the time." The friend described it as the voice of someone cornered, trying to find a sliver of comfort in familiar connections. The call ended abruptly. The friend never heard from Patricia again, and the story faded from public attention. But it adds another dimension to the puzzle. Was she quietly trying to hold on to whatever piece of her old self remained? You might wonder how Hollywood factors into this story. Patricia never set out to be part of Tinseltown's allure. She was no aspiring actress, no shining starlet with a dream of the silver screen. But ironically, the sensational kidnapping case propelled her name into national headlines more intensely than many celebrities could ever achieve through standard methods of publicity. Over time, in a world where true crime narratives and sensational stories frequently get adapted for film or television, Patricia Hearst became one of those household names that people recognized, even if they couldn't quite recall the full timeline of events. Years after her ordeal, Patricia ventured into cameo appearances in a few films, most notably with director John Waters, famed for his offbeat style and dark humor. In roles that often involved tongue-in-cheek references to her past, she showed a willingness to lean into the bizarre fascination the public held for her. If you watch some of those cameos, it's easy to imagine them as a kind of personal reclamation. Instead of being the puppet of a radical group or the subject of a media circus, Patricia Hearst appeared to be saying, "I'll tell my story my own way." But she never offered a comedic wink about her captivity in these roles. She stuck to zany characters that had nothing to do with the SLA. Perhaps that was another method of distancing herself from the old nightmares. Among those who defended her, few were as vocal as renowned author and attorney Vincent Bugliosi, who, though not her lawyer, spoke out about the psychological complexities of her case. He criticized the prosecution's approach for failing to adequately account for the extent of Patricia's captivity-induced trauma, comparing her situation to hostages in war zones who come to identify with their captors as a coping strategy. He argued that a purely legalistic lens ignored the human factor of survival instinct. Meanwhile, detractors pointed to recordings where Patricia seemed to participate willingly in SLA ideological discussions, at times displaying what appeared to be genuine fervor for their cause. The truth, as always, seems to reside in a hazy space between innocence and culpability. The debate raged well after her release from prison, into her reintroduction to society, and even after she wrote about her ordeal. By the late 1980s and 1990s, Patricia tried to lead a more private life, marrying Bernard Shaw, her former bodyguard, raising 2 daughters, and focusing on philanthropic endeavors away from the glare of cameras. From time to time, tabloids revisited her story, especially whenever radical politics erupted somewhere in the world, and journalists remembered the once infamous American heiress who picked up a gun. But as years went on, new controversies crowded the headlines. The Symbionese Liberation Army faded into a historical footnote, and Patricia found moments of relative peace, forging bonds with family members and friends who had stood by her side through the tumult. Yet the emotional scars ran deep. In one of her quieter interviews, one not widely broadcast, Patricia spoke about nightmares that haunted her for years. She would sometimes awaken with a racing heart, convinced that the claustrophobic closet in which the SLA had originally confined her was closing in again. In these moments, she recalled, it felt as though no amount of daylight could wash away the memory of those first terrifying weeks. The sense of betrayal, the fear of death, and the possibility that her identity had been irreparably changed. These were burdens she carried long after her public trial ended. There's a segment of Patricia's life story that is rarely mentioned, and it revolves around her attempts at therapy and her interactions with other trauma survivors. At one point, she was invited to speak informally at a small gathering of ex-hostages, people who had lived through different extremist kidnappings in Latin America and the Middle East. Though no journalists were present, a few who attended later mentioned that Patricia was incredibly attentive, listening more than she spoke. She reportedly noted how hearing others' stories of captivity made her feel less alone, that maybe her own ordeal was part of a tragically common pattern, radical or criminal groups targeting innocents to make political statements. She never overshadowed the room with her fame. In fact, according to those who were there, she seemed almost relieved to be among people who understood, without her needing to defend herself, what relentless terror can do to the human mind. Of course, controversies never fully faded. For some observers, Patricia Hearst's post-prison life represented undue privilege. They noted that only someone with her family's influence could have secured presidential clemency. They argued that countless other convicts, some with equally compelling stories of duress, remained behind bars with no hope of release, let alone a pardon. For many, the notion of the Hearst name, stepping in to rescue one of its own, remains an uncomfortable reminder of class disparities in the justice system. Patricia herself didn't frequently comment on this aspect, beyond acknowledging gratitude for the commutation and, years later, the pardon. She insisted that any other hostage in her predicament would deserve the same mercy. Historically and culturally, Patricia Hearst's saga reminds us of the volatile intersection between wealth, media influence, and radical politics. In the mid-1970s, the turmoil of Vietnam and Watergate had already undermined public trust in institutions. When Patricia Hearst appeared on the scene, apparently discarding her birthright to join a violent group, it struck a deep chord. Her kidnapping felt like an allegory for a country kidnapping itself, caught between traditions of privilege and the fury of those who felt excluded. It's one reason why her tale didn't simply fade away with time. The questions it raised about how easily any one of us might be molded under duress still linger. Patricia Hearst's case blurred the line between victim and collaborator, a haunting ambiguity that fueled debates long after the courtroom verdict. Her image evoked both sympathy and suspicion, reminding us how survival, trauma, and identity are never easily untangled. Hollywood has occasionally dipped its toe in the water, producing made-for-TV movies about her kidnapping and trial. Typically, those dramatizations focus on the wild extremes: bank robbery, gun-toting, the tense showdowns. Sometimes they include glimpses of Patricia's captivity, illustrating how she might have been tormented by SLA leaders. Rarely do they pause to consider the long aftermath, the therapy sessions, the everyday struggle to rebuild an identity. Nor do they linger on the family dynamic that must have changed irrevocably. The father's heartbreak, the sister's confusion, the fiancé's disorientation, the swirl of reporters outside the Hearst mansion. The complexity is difficult to compress into a 2-hour script, and so it's often reduced to bullet points of shock and scandal. But if we look closely, we can find traces of Patricia's quieter resilience. After the noise died down, she was by no means a darling of Hollywood, but she did appear in multiple film projects, each time portraying a fictional character rather than a version of herself. It's as if, by playing these oddball roles, a dotty suburban mother, an eccentric outsider, she was stepping farther away from the forced role the SLA had thrust upon her. One cameo in particular stands out. She briefly played a character who helps run a restaurant in a comedic scene. Observers can't help but read into it. She was playing a mundane part, far from the glare of being a revolutionary or a criminal. Perhaps in an odd way that normalcy was the real triumph. Just being an ordinary person in a comedic film, delivering lines that had nothing to do with her infamous past. What can we learn from her story beyond the sensational bullet points? Perhaps it reminds us how fragile the boundaries of our own identities can be when stripped of safety and subjected to relentless pressure. We like to think we know who we are, that we'd never compromise our moral compass, no matter the threat. But her story challenges that assumption. It also underlines how the media can shape and often distort a person's narrative, especially when that narrative is convenient for selling papers or grabbing primetime ratings. And let's not forget how the story underscores the reach of privilege, fueling debates that haven't lost their relevance. Patricia Hearst is a living reminder that true stories can be stranger than fiction. She's a symbol, whether she wants to be or not, of one of Hollywood's and America's most surreal collisions between inherited privilege, violent extremism, media spectacle, and personal endurance. The lesson is a humbling one. Identity is fragile. The line between victim and collaborator isn't always crystal clear, especially when your life is on the line. And no one, no matter how wealthy or protected, is truly immune to being caught in the chaos of history's storms. Her story doesn't ask us to neatly pick sides or come to a tidy moral verdict. It merely invites us to acknowledge how complicated a person's journey can become when the worst nightmares of an era converge on their doorstep. And perhaps it prompts us to wonder, with a little more humility, just how easily fear and isolation might overpower our convictions if the unthinkable happened to us. That final question reverberates in the hush that follows, a solemn reminder of our shared humanity, fragile, hopeful, and so often at the mercy of forces larger than ourselves.